I think a lot of people are afraid of some of the stuff I talk about, and I'm not even political. I'm not even, I don't even get really aggressive with any of it. I'm just looking at the philosophical, the psychological, cognitive background of it all. And even that stuff for some people, they're like, is this safe? Is this safe to listen to? Like, can I listen to this?
Yeah, that it's funny that the thing you said about like, yeah, am I allowed to listen to this? Is this safe? So my book, questions the traditional Christian position on hell. And I have had a lot of people say to me that it was very difficult for them to purchase my book, that they, in the act of like going, like they wanted to buy it, but there was like a fear that was like, does this make me a heretic to buy this book? Like, if I, if I buy this book that says maybe hell's not a real place, does that mean maybe I'm going to hell for associating myself with this book? And one girl said to me, she said, I had to trick myself I had to tell myself, okay, just because I'm buying the book doesn't mean that I have to agree with it. I can just read it and I can like sort through it. And, I don't have to agree with it. And so she told herself that in order to buy the book, and she still like had a lot of religious guilt. And so I shared that message in my stories and put up a poll and was like, hey, curious, how many of you who went to buy my book felt some sort of religious guilt, like maybe buying this book makes you a bad person or something? And it was 69% of the people who answered in the poll said that just buying a book that had this alternative position made them feel fear. And yet they wanted to buy it, right? So in other words, their conscience was telling them, yeah, that hell thing, that feels wrong. There's something off about that. There's something inside me that says that God is more expansive than that, more loving than that. But that part of me, well, that might be Satan. That good part of me that's saying maybe God is not going to punish people for being the wrong religion. That's how confused we've been by this rigid dogmatism that our own consciences, our own inner knowing, that voice of love inside of us that wants to accept other people, that wants to like break down those binaries. We're not sure if that's God or actually the devil. That's how confused we are.
Brian,
What's up, Trey?
it's a pleasure to have you on. Thanks for joining me today.
Yeah, good to be here.
I'm excited to jump into this. I've been following you for a little while on social media, and I've really enjoyed your content. For those of you that aren't familiar, Brian has garnered quite the following with what he's talking about. So it's kind of striking a chord within the mainstream social medias, and I think it's very relevant today. So before we jump into that, just give a little bit of a framing for those of you that aren't familiar, just kind of shortly what it is you do and what's your what's the heart behind a lot of this.
Yeah, so I used to be an evangelical pastor, and I started posting a few years ago after stepping away from the ministry and undergoing a process of deconstruction, reconsidering some of the theologies that I was both raised in and even then, was a part of supporting the structure of as a pastor and preaching. And in stepping out of the institution and the evangelical movement, and really ultimately breaking with some of those relationships, which I think really is part of the process of deconstruction that's hardest, is the loss of belonging. Because for so many of us, it's not just stepping away from particular ideas, but knowing that we'll be losing also our place within those communities. But that really freed me up to be very vulnerable and authentic in my presentation of what I was wrestling with. And so I just started really speaking honestly online about, well, first of all, a lot of it started with my support for queer people. That was some of the initial posts that blew up, and that ultimately caused my former church to kind of cut me off, I guess you might say. They removed my 8.5 years of sermons from their website and sent out like a church-wide email about me and that sort of thing. And so when that happened, that was tough. It wasn't really unexpected, but it really did also free me up to say, okay, that's not whose approval I'm seeking. I'm really just trying to be true to myself, and also to the people that I feel like have been harmed by evangelicalism and the systems that I used to be a part of. And so in speaking up from that place, yeah, it kind of did grow a platform. And one of the things that I talked most about in coming out of evangelicalism was my deconstruction of fear-based religion. We can get more into this later, but I ended up writing a book called Hellbent, which came out just a little over a month ago, really, which is about how that fear of hell is so deeply woven into our spirituality in most forms of Christianity, especially American evangelicalism, that many of us really met God under those circumstances, that if you didn't come to God in this particular way, then you would go to hell. And so the choice that we made was almost no choice at all. It was very much under threat of punishment, which did affect our very understanding of what spirituality was. And so untangling that has been a big part of what I've done as well, and the book that just recently came out.
Yeah. You know, it was really funny because right after, we scheduled to be on, I was at a coffee shop right down the street, and there was a guy that I know that has walked away from faith. He's kind of deconstructed. He's in between right now. He's not really sure what he's like, what his spirituality looks like. And I casually mentioned, because I was like, there's a chance he probably follows you, right? Like I see a lot of the people that I know follow you, and I asked him, I was like, "Hey, have you heard of Brian Recker?" And his eyes kind of got big. He's like, "Oh man, yeah." And I was like, "What?" He goes, "Dude, like a while back, I don't know what year, but he was like, my dad basically called me one day and was like really upset because this youth pastor had left the church, and he was just worried, like he was like throwing his life away, and he was walking away from the faith, and he was doing all this stuff." And he was talking about you. And so it was really funny because I was like, wow, that's so crazy how, that connection was a little crazy, but also just the fact that, like, in his eyes, and, basically to what you're saying, that loss of community, it's like, yeah, that's very real. Like people are like, oh, he's throwing away his life, or he's losing,
Yeah.
it's like,
That's interesting. I'm curious who that person was, if maybe their dad was at my old church. But no, it's true, and that kept me there for a while. That knowledge, the knowledge of how they would talk about me if I left in a particular way, because I knew how people like that were perceived. When I was
yeah,
in the movement, we talked about people who left or deconstructed, they backslid or they fell away, or, it's a slippery slope into some sort of liberalism. They're not Christians anymore. Now they're the object of prayer requests. They're basically seen as a mission field. And it was a really challenging thing to think about people that I knew, that I loved, that I had walked alongside through life, that helped me move, that were there when my kids were born. Like those people thinking of me in that way was really hard. And that, I think, is for a lot of people the thing that keeps them from stepping out and being honest about what they're feeling and thinking. It is a form of control, unfortunately. So, I'm not surprised by that.
yeah. And it's interesting too, because I mean, I remember that too, because I came out of the evangelical stream as well. And I was having a lot of experiences that were really authentic, right? Like a lot of that kind of not drew me in, but I was like, okay, well, surely this is what this is about, right? Like other people are curious about following this path towards love, and this is what the Bible seems to be teaching. And the deeper I got into it, the more I seen that it's like, okay, everybody's got different agendas with this, and everybody's kind of got a different framing. And one of the biggest things that I was always most uncomfortable with was the secret agent, the secret agent prayer groups, and I just always felt like it was such a bifurcated psychological split that would happen, in which you are now disconnecting yourself from the rest of the world, and it's like people are no longer people, right? They're the mission field, or there's that kind of that hidden agenda. And maybe it comes from a good place, or it comes from that desire of like, well, I don't want them to go to hell, or I don't want them to miss out on the goodness and the joy that I've found. But I found just the way that we would go about it being a little perverse, or just it was very inauthentic to me. Like it just felt like I was like, if the person that I was praying for was in the room right now hearing this, how would they feel? Like I would always think that. Like,
Absolutely. Totally,
so
dude. I talk about this at length in my book. One of the problems with the doctrine of hell is that it does alienate you in your relationships. It changes the way that you view other people. I mean, to put people in a category of damned, it does change how you view those people and how you treat those people. And to have yourself in a category of saved, I mean, when you believe that the information and knowledge and beliefs that you have are going to result in eternal heaven and salvation, but that other people who don't agree with those are going to suffer for eternity, that really does shape your worldview. And not that there's not other components besides hell that shape this, but that really is like a trump card over all of it. If you're ever starting to feel like maybe this is like a bad way to treat somebody, maybe actually I shouldn't, treat them in this dehumanizing sort of way, that they need to change and be the way that I want them to be. As soon as you might think that, then you can immediately think, well, no, like they're going to hell. Like the only way to love them is to long for them to be where I'm at, because I'm going to heaven. And so really it kind of changes the definition of love to anything that you're doing to try to get somebody to not go to hell. I distinctly remember when I was a kid how uncomfortable I would feel when, like, my dad, who was the fundamentalist Baptist pastor of the church that I went to growing up, when he would preach sermons about hell. For example, one week he had invited my uncle, who was not a Christian, to church. And, we were all praying for him to get saved, for my uncle to get saved. And my dad, the guest speaker that was there that Sunday, preached a sermon called How Hot Is Hell? And I remember as like a kid sitting there squirming, feeling very uncomfortable, feeling very awkward, getting sweaty, thinking like, oh my God, this must be hitting my uncle in such a uncomfortable way. Like, how weird that must feel to know, like, oh, they're talking about me. They're telling me that I'm going to go to hell. Like, I was sitting there thinking that. And then the next thought, though, to follow that is, oh, I feel guilty now for feeling that way, because of course he needs to hear this. If hell is real, then this is the truth that he needs to hear. And it might be an uncomfortable truth, but I'm supposed to want him to hear that. In fact, if I were a better Christian, I should be telling him that. Right? Because don't I love my uncle? Don't I want to be in eternity with him and that sort of thing? And so it's a very confused and muddy spirituality where actually bullying, aggression, pushing your beliefs on someone else, being not humble and entering a relationship with mutuality, saying, hey, what do you have to teach me? But rather this posture of superiority is, you need what I have, that is actually baptized as holy. And in that sense, that doctrine, hell, really causes us to enter relationships with a lot of superiority in a way that Jesus did not interact with people at all.
Yeah, and it's interesting too because I mean, I talk about this so much, and it is weird because sometimes, and I don't know, maybe you feel this as well, but sometimes, like, I feel like I can have a conversation or lay out certain ways of participatory or perspective knowing as opposed to just propositional beliefs. I think in the modern day evangelical world, the belief is we can obtain salvation by organizing an inner coherence of propositions, right? Like it's just like this coherence of beliefs. Like if I can believe the right things in the right way, then I can align myself towards God and towards transcendence and towards avoiding hell. But if you look throughout, like, the church fathers, you look throughout history, you look at indigenous tribes, you look at all these other people, it's like beliefs are such a small portion of the human experience. It's like it's nested within this perspectile, like, experience of um like tasting something and seeing something. And I do feel like, we're kind of in this propositional tyranny right now where it's like the most important thing is like what we believe as opposed to what is our practice, what's our experience, what are we seeing, like, and then because it's like if we do that, it's exactly what you're saying, we're not fighting anybody on beliefs. Like, we're walking with people as they're experiencing certain things. And I think a lot of the evangelical church is like, I mean, you see glimpses of that. Well, they'll say it, but it's almost like, yeah, 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 like we experience Jesus. But the most important thing is making sure your belief system is oriented correctly. So it's almost like, oh, we've got it backwards a little bit, it seems like.
Yeah, I agree with that. I think that, early on, Christianity had a lot more diversity of thought as well. When the empire got involved, they really wanted to nail down creeds, councils, formulatize these doctrines, really figure out what the right beliefs are that we're all supposed to hold, as opposed to holding onto mystery and ambiguity, something that is very common in Judaism. Judaism is much more comfortable with uncertainty, doubt, ambiguity, and mystery than Christianity has been. And I think a lot of that has to do with the involvement of the empire, that Rome wanted to control. I mean, it's hard to control something that's ambiguous and mysterious and open-ended and can take a lot of different forms. And so empires like black and white thinking, they like things nailed down and buttoned up. And so that level of control, I think it bore bad fruit too. Like, I can see some value in having, yeah, let's have some get togethers, have some councils where we talk about what's the best way to process some of these things. That's great. But if on the other end of that, we're going to persecute the people who, ended up with different beliefs and like cut their heads off, then it's like, it's actually, that feels like
Yeah.
not what Jesus would have done. That doesn't seem like actually Christian at all. So I don't know that that has been a net positive for Christianity, but it's true that certainty was very much a part of the framework that I received. And again, I don't want to always bring everything back to hell. That is what my book is about, but I can see how that really makes the certainty piece very, very important, because if hell is on the line, then certainty is really demanded. It's like really important to know for sure that you're not going there. And so you can see why, I mean, from an early age, I wanted to really be sure that my beliefs were right, because I really wanted to be sure that I was in and not out. The stakes were just really, really high. And so as a result, you kind of had to manufacture certainty about things that you can't actually be certain about. Nobody knows for sure what happens when you die. That's not the kind of thing you can know for sure. Anybody who says that they know for sure, they're probably selling something, or they're manufacturing false certainty because they are afraid of what could happen if they're not sure, like if hell is on the line. But none of that really leads to authenticity. It doesn't really cultivate the ability to start asking questions about, like, well, what beliefs lead to a flourishing community? What beliefs cause love to bloom in me? You're not so much thinking about that. It's not experiential in that way. It really is like, well, what's the right thing that I'm supposed to believe? And most of us were also socialized to receive those quote unquote right beliefs from a particular kind of person, from an authoritative patriarchal figure, typically a straight white guy who told us what we were supposed to believe. And we didn't know how to listen to ourselves when the things that were being said were at odds with our own conscience or inner voice, because that, well, what if I'm wrong? And I mean, the hell is hot, so you didn't want to be wrong.
Well, and I totally agree, but I also think also, from what I've experienced, even aside from hell, like the world can be scary for a lot of, I mean, for all of us. I think there's a lot of unknowns within the world, and I think the ego likes to have a sense of control and survivor. It's like it's a survival mechanism of the ego to want to make sure we can orchestrate and find that coherence. And I think for a lot of people that I know, the idea of stepping outside of that framework into this numinous unknown of the unconscious is a very I mean that's scary. That's ego, that's an egoic death. But that's what the death that's what this is, right? That's what Christ is. It's the death and the resurrection and is dying to the ego. And I think Jung does an amazing job of really making these connections as to what it looks like when we actually begin to embody Christ and we actually begin to follow that path. But I think a lot of times making that transition, I feel like is very hard, because it's like modern day Christianity or modern day evangelicalism, or at least the version that we have, seems to be like, here's a way to have God and not die to your ego. You can have a belief and have this stuff while you can still maintain all the things that you think are right. But at the end of the day, if you haven't died to your belief system as well, then you haven't really participated in what Christ is doing. And that's in my opinion. It's interesting. I see that as a very much of a protective mechanism for a lot of people.
Oh, I agree with that. I think that, I mean, I can even see that process that you just described in the deconstruction process. In other words, like a lot of times when people are embracing a process of deconstruction, reconsidering a lot of the beliefs that they were formed with, which involves dying to certain aspects of your identity, like I'm one of the saved ones, I believe the right thing, I'm a part of the correct religion, I'm a part of the right tribe, I'm an insider. Like those are all very comforting illusions. Those did a lot for, I mean, we held on to those things because they were doing a lot for us. We got a lot of safety from those certainties, and taking them apart is a kind of a death, but it's a really holy thing. So ironically, a lot of times Christians are watching people deconstruct or leave the church or begin to question some of these things, and that looks like a movement away from God to some people, but that's only because that God is, I don't think that's really what God is not the one that's, protecting our egos. I think God is the one calling us into the wilderness often. And so for me, it's a really holy thing, that process of deconstruction, even though it looks like potentially abandoning some of the outward forms of religiosity that you were raised with. And I don't think that that drawing nearer to God necessarily means you're going to still land in an organized religion or still have even a relationship with the church. That might look like that for some, maybe not for others. It looks different for different people, but that process of dying is, yeah, I see it in the deconstruction process, is all I'm saying.
No, I mean, even at a cognitive level, like that's the way the psyche works. Like in order to have an anagogic movement towards transcendence or towards the divine, you have to break up constraints. Like if you don't break up the constraints, you're not going to have the space for new emergence to come. It's like the 9 dot problem. I don't know if you've ever seen it, but it's like you have 9 dots and you try to draw 4 lines and you're like, oh, well, I can't because it doesn't work. But then once you realize, like, if I go outside of the box and go up and then down and then over, now I can make those 4 lines work. So you have to deconstruct the way that you're framing that problem in order for you to ever see a higher resolution of what it is. And I think you're exactly right. Like, if we don't have that built into our framework, like, then all we're doing is participating in this cognitive bias of this loop of like, well, let's have empire. Let's build things that we know that we can already control, or we can have. Capitalism makes it worse. We don't even need to go into that. But I think what you're saying is, it's like, yeah, it's 100%. It's like, how do we get to there though? And I think that's where I notice the biggest break, where it's like, I could say all this, like you and I can have this conversation, and I think we could lay out some really excellent, amazing points. And something I notice is that no matter what you say, in a lot of cases, it's like, yeah, it's just like something that's not that, like that idea is just seems so foreign and seems so backwards that for some people, it's like even to entertain it is such a hard step.
Which idea? Just entering a process
Like
of deconstruction?
the idea of deconstruction being meshed in the practice of Christianity, or like,
But yeah.
how,
Well,
you know what I mean?
I think it's I mean it's in the Bible. Like, it's interesting. Richard Rohr's new book, The Tears of Things, is really great. I just was reading that recently, and it's about the prophets, the Old Testament prophets, and he points out how the prophets were, that was like an actual title. That was like a religious person that was thought to speak for God, but their whole role within their system was to challenge the system, was to speak out against both the king and the religious authorities and elites, and basically be pointing out from the margins how these structures were actually oppressive. And that prophetic voice was, I mean, we have it right there in the Bible. They were always rejected in various ways. Jesus says, you who stoned the prophets and killed those that like God sent to you. And we still do that. We don't like those voices, even within ourselves, because it threatens the stability of the ego of the empire. And yet that is where God was said to be speaking from. God was always the one speaking through the prophets, through that voice of critique. And Jesus also was a voice of critique, very much a Hebrew prophet in line with voices like Isaiah and Jeremiah. And in the same way, they killed Jesus, right? And Jesus was very much doing a deconstructive work. You have heard it said, but I say unto you. And he came out of a tradition. All of us start within a tradition. All of us start with something. And at some point, part of growing up, part of maturing, is recognizing that there were a lot of things that were given to me that I didn't choose for myself. And there's a lot of people who think different ways. And you do have to, it's really hard to have beginner's mind within Christianity when, when you're 5 years old and you're told, here's the gospel, God is going to punish you unless you get saved and unless you accept Jesus as your personal Lord and Savior. And so don't you want to do that? Do you want to get saved and go to heaven, or do you want to not do that and go to hell? And you make that decision, which is almost no choice at all when you're very, very young. And then to reevaluate that later on in life can be really scary, to have beginner's mind when so much is at stake, not just, again, even with eternity, but also within the network of relationships that have been established. So it is a very brave thing. And it might even feel like stepping away from God, but that's only because the version of God that many of us were taught was essentially just labeling the hierarchy of power as God. God was basically a stand-in for whatever authoritarian dominator, dominating presence, a patriarchal authoritarian figure, a big punishing guy. If that's your God, then it might feel like walking away from God to question some of those systems. But what if God was never an authoritarian punisher? What if that's not who God was? What if you're going to find God in that voice that you were told you weren't even allowed to listen to?
Yeah. Well, and with that, and I think this is kind of a nuance that I think subtly gets thrown into a lot of stuff today is that, my experience, I'm assuming this was probably yours too, is that a lot of these figures, like after Christ, like Paul and Augustine and Luther, it's like they almost get treated as Jesus, where it's like their words were like, oh, yeah, like these guys were, anointed and they were speaking God. And we won't realize that a lot of the pivotal shaping of the theology that we have today came from these people that maybe it wasn't even a conscious act of evil, but you get these subconscious projections as opposed to how they viewed life. Like how Paul had this moral, rigid background in which he was like fitting into this transformational thing that he was experiencing. And yet we don't think about Paul as a human. We don't think about these projections coming out of things that he hadn't individuated or dealt with. And then you have Augustine who wrote, I could not stop licking the wounds of lust. It's like we had obviously this guy who had a sexual addiction that could not fathom a God that wasn't able to meet that need or had that sense of justice built in and like, he's got to do something about this because I can't stop it. I can't stop my own sin. That it can't be something that I'm dealing with. This has to be built into the fabric of how God is. And even with Luther, same way, like he couldn't stop sinning. He kept going to confession. He could not stop being bad. And so he had to make this thing, okay, well, surely God looks like this because of my own personal experience. And I think that what I notice in the modern or the evangelical church today is like the lack of asking the right question towards the history of it, just kind of accepting. It's like, well, we have this now. And I think we all just kind of assume it's like, well, this, because it's survived to this point, it has to be right. And that to me is one of the more frustrating things of like even having conversations. Cause I'm like, I can't really have a conversation with you unless you understand how Neoplatonism influenced the Bible. I can't really have a conversation with you unless you understand how there was no one Christianity. And it was this, there's like a plethora of different types of ideas floating around. But yet, like, and this brings me to what I want to talk about. It's like this ownership of like we have the one true, not just gospel, but the one true version of Christianity. And if you don't fall in this, you're not a Christian. And I think that's very, very dangerous. And it's leading to like a lot of nationalistic stuff, a lot of mongering fear based that we're seeing today.
Yeah, that need to have insiders and outsiders is so central to most of Christian thought. And like determining who is and who isn't a Christian is, it's such a like a witch hunt culture. People are constantly telling me that I'm not a real Christian. Thankfully, there's no authenticating body for that. There's nobody that can determine that.
Where's your card, Brian? Your Christian card. You gotta.
Yeah, my card. I'm not yeah, did I pay my dues this month? Like, yeah, maybe I'm expired. I just don't care about those labels that much. I think again that a lot of times it matters who's a real Christian, who's not. A lot of times it's like, well, what do you mean by that, right? Like in terms of values, I might have a lot more in common with somebody who doesn't identify as a Christian at all than somebody who does, even though I still identify as a Christian. That might have nothing to do with whether or not we even, do you believe people deserve health care? I care about something like that. It's like, I don't know if you label yourself as Christian, like, I don't actually know if you're going to embody what I think the values of Jesus really were. That has almost nothing to do with it. A lot of times the need for that label is to determine who's in and who's out, both in this life and in the next life, So it is like, are you the kind of person who's going to hell or going to heaven? Are you the kind of person that I am going to treat as a mission project or somebody that I could consider family? And I think that actually one of the things Jesus was trying to do was to actually break down those kinds of barriers and to stop with this binary thinking. And unfortunately, much of Christianity has actually perpetuated and maybe even exacerbated that binary.
Yeah, and it makes it and I think it goes back to that thing of like safety, right? If I know, if you can tell me, if you can speak or give me the code, if you say, like, yes, I believe in this, then I will feel more comfortable to converse with you or talk to you or be in the room with you or be in a relationship with you. Whereas if you don't say these certain things, I feel like people have, it's an underdeveloped sense of, like what you're saying. It's like, I don't really care as like what you say you believe. It's like I will know by my interactions with you what your intentions are in this relationship and in the world, and I can make a judgment based on, is that the kind of energy that I would like to be around, as opposed to, needing to hear a certain thing in order to be like, okay, now I can engage in what you're talking about. 'Cause I think a lot of people are afraid of some of the stuff I talk about, and I'm not even political. I'm not even, I don't even get really aggressive with any of it. I'm just looking at the philosophical, the psychological, cognitive background of it all. And even that stuff, for some people, they're like, wait a minute, what do you, is this safe? Is this safe to listen to? Like, can I listen to this? And I think it's really sad because I think there's a lot of good information that we can learn from people that don't claim what, or
Totally.
don't identify as how we identify, which is what I hear from you.
Yeah, that it's funny that the thing he said about like, yeah, am I allowed to listen to this? Is this safe? It kind of reminds me of some of the feedback I've been even hearing about my book. And so my book, questions the traditional Christian position on hell. And I have had a lot of people say to me that it was very difficult for them to purchase my book, that they, in the act of like going, like they wanted to buy it, but there was like a fear that was like, does this make me a heretic to buy this book? Like, if I buy this book that says maybe hell's not a real place, does that mean maybe I'm going to hell for associating myself with this book? And one girl said to me, she said, I had to trick myself I had to tell myself, okay, just because I'm buying the book doesn't mean that I have to agree with it. I can just read it and I can like sort through it. And, I don't have to agree with it. And so she told herself that in order to buy the book, and she still like had a lot of religious guilt. And so I shared that message in my stories and put up a poll and was like, hey, curious, how many of you who went to buy my book felt some sort of religious guilt, like maybe buying this book makes you a bad person or something? And it was 69% of the people who answered in the poll said that just buying a book that had this alternative position made them feel fear. And so that's how deep it goes, to the inability, and yet they wanted to buy it, right? So in other words, their conscience was telling them, yeah, that hell thing, that feels wrong. There's something off about that. There's something inside me that says that God is more expansive than that, more loving than that. But that part of me, well, that might be Satan. That good part of me that's saying maybe God is not going to punish people for being the wrong religion, like that's how confused we've been by this rigid dogmatism, that our own consciences, our own inner knowing, that voice of love inside of us that wants to accept other people, that wants to like break down those binaries. Like, we're not sure if that's God or actually the devil. That's how confused
Yeah.
we are.
Well, and it goes back to Luther. You can look at these thoughts of like Luther having this deep suspicion of his own inner desires and making a whole doctrine, making a whole theology around that is so interesting, because you see where that trickles down, where there's like a deep suspicion of self. There's this deep suspicion of inner knowing. And that is hard. And I think, that's why I really like Jung's work, because he really paints Christianity in this way of like, the reality of it is the only place any of us are ever going to actually meet God is by facing that fear and going inside to, because I would argue that's where God is, like that's behind that fear. For anybody, like behind that fear, that connection to your inner voice, that calling, that's the experience of the divine. Like, for anybody that's felt that, I think, they would agree. It's like once you feel that, you're like, wow, there's a whole world in there. And it's really sad, because I think it's like, the way I imagine it is like you're trapped in this propositional box of like beliefs in your mind. And God's like, it's like tip of the iceberg. And God's like at the bottom of this, inviting you in. And there's this layer of fear. It's like, well, if you go there, it could be bad. It's like, but if you don't go
Mm,
there, you're going to miss it all. Like, you're going to miss
yeah.
it all.
It's almost like those beliefs and like propositional dogmatic beliefs are like protecting us from a genuine encounter with God, who's like behind those things. Like they're almost like a safeguard. Like God is so wild and free, and it involves like a certain courage to even go there. This is going to transform you. This is going to be the death of things that you've been holding on to, that your ego does not want to let go of. You've carved out an identity, and it's kind of working, even though you know that's not who you really are. And yeah, like it's going to be scary, but you have to get like under those things. And that's where God is. And those beliefs, it's like a safe way of being able to say you have God, because it's like, well, I believe the right things. And actually it's actually keeping you from God.
Yeah, and it's really tough too because it keeps you from God and it keeps you from life in a lot of ways, right? It keeps you from experiencing the fullness of life. It keeps you from enjoying things that I feel like, I think about my life when I was in Christianity because I have a dance background. And I remember when I was in school for dance, it was like such a freeing experience. This curious exploration of life, of like seeing the texture and just the ecology of how God emits himself into the world and just how you see all of these textures of life. And when you play with that, how beautiful and enriching it is. And then when you get into this strain of like getting stuck in the belief systems or the minds, it's like you're almost cut off. Like you're isolated from these things that like it's the agent arena. It's like you're able to feel God inside and then see how that connects with everything around you. And I just looked because I would always say, it's like, guys, if this is all about just getting people saved, like what happens like, let's do a thought experiment. Like, okay, we've done it. Tomorrow we wake up and we did it. Like we got everybody saved and we accomplished the goal. Like, what do we then do? Then what happens?
Well, I mean, we even know from Christian history that just other people being Christians won't stop them from othering and going to war against each other, because then you'll find little things to nitpick. And so right now, almost no
Mm,
Christian denominations really care that much about like baptism styles. Like if yeah, like there's different denominations that baptize like by immersion or do the sprinkling. And if they'll still have conferences together now, like the Gospel Coalition, for instance, will have Presbyterians and Baptists preaching, headlining the same conference, as long as they agree that like queer people are evil, right? But in the medieval times, they were literally killing each other over those exact same theological differences. And so the goalposts are always moving, but that need to other and have an other, that exists actually within Christianity, as long as you're still attached to that binary thinking.
yeah. Yeah. Shifting gears just a little bit. Like people that have walked away from Christianity and maybe began to deconstruct or began to try to find something else. And then now they're lost in a sense of, I don't know how to put this together. Like, I don't know what I believe or how I believe it. And, I'd like to know, but I just feel like that's not an option anymore of like being a Christian or entertaining a faith-based community.
Think that for a lot of us, we had this certainty, right? We had rigid boundaries, we had safety within a community, and we knew what was expected of us within that community, what beliefs were expected of us. And so deconstructing from that, I think because that's all we've ever known, we're kind of thinking that we're going to find a version of that again on the other side of it. And I think for me, it was like, okay, actually, I'm never going to have that again. I'm not going to find a new certainty. I'm not going to find new rigid boundaries. I'm not going to even find a kind of a community like that in the same way that is ultimately our deep, rich community was so deep and rich, partly because it was exclusionary. And so when you have those kinds of boundaries, cults have very rich community. And so I'm not necessarily calling evangelicalism a cult, but cults do tend to have very rich insular, they have traditions, and that sort of, and your belonging is really thick, but it's all hinged on having that outsider, right? And so for me, coming out, there was a bit of a wilderness where I felt a little bit unmoored. I felt quite anxious, and there was even some depression associated with that, which I think makes sense when you're going through a major transition. But I think for me, the process is not finding my comfort and safety by embedding myself in another rigid community, but actually learning how to be comfortable in a space of uncertainty, learning how to be uncomfortable without ever having to plant my flag in the ground in the same way that I did before. And it was like, I know that I know that I know these things. I don't think I'll ever have that same sense of like, well, now I have found my new beliefs that I can plant the flag just as deeply as before, but in a better, this is just better beliefs, but I'm going to still hold them with the same way. It's not just holding new beliefs in the same way, it's holding our beliefs in a different way, I think, for me. And that is a little scary. I think people want to be told what's right. And you're just not going to be able to be told. You're going to have to learn how to listen to yourself. And that might be a constant evolution. And so it's becoming more comfortable with the constant change. That change is a new constant for me, not certainty, but actual evolution becoming the way that for me, I plan that 10 years from now, I will think some things differently than I think now. But I do hope that that same break that happens where I'm like, oh my gosh, I'm losing who I was and I'm having to enter this. I don't think it's going to be quite as dramatic as that because I have a new posture towards change than I did before. I have a new posture towards evolution that really welcomes it, that sees it as essential to the spiritual journey. Because you're listening, we're constantly taking in new information, and that's a good thing. And we don't have to be afraid of that. We don't have to be like that person who's like, can I even buy this book? Does that make me a heretic? Actually, we should want to interact with new ideas. And if they seem loving and they draw us into love, we can be okay with that, where love leads us. And so, yeah, I think that's what I would say is like to relax a little and to just know that you're going to, so I think you're going to have to grieve that too, because it was nice. It was, like I said, the illusion was providing things. That's why we held on to it for so long. Also, have grace for yourself. Like, don't be so hard on yourself. Look how much you walked away from. Look how much it was doing for you. That was so brave. To even be willing to question any of it was so brave. But now you're not, I think you're going to have to grieve the fact that you're not going to find something quite like that again. It would actually be bad to lock yourself in again, because then you would just, when that frame broke, you'd have the same shattering all over again, where some people do that. I've met people that have been in multiple cults. Like they've gone from cult to cult because they were like, okay, that the problem was I was just in the wrong one. And now I'm in the right one. I found the new one. They've got the answers. People have been like, I know people that have been Mormons and Scientologists. Like
Wow.
they just went from one to another. And it's like, no,
Well,
you're
yeah.
missing it. It's not like, and then it's like, now I'm going to become an evangelical and have my evangelical moment maybe. But it's like, no, like you have to have a new posture towards uncertainty
Well,
and
yeah.
truth.
Yeah, I've met two types of people. I've met one, people that will swing, and then I've also met the people that are so paralyzed by the fear of joining another cult or being influenced to, they're like, oh, I don't want to ever go back to that kind of world again, that they live in this like liminal space of like I can't trust anything. It's just this hermeneutics of suspicion. It's like across the board, everything or everybody has some motive, or there's something that is, I'm not participating in anything like that. So I kind of see it. I've seen it both ways, but I love what you said about being able to realize that whatever it is, it's not going to look like it looks. Whether or not you're worried about it looking like it looks, or whether or not you want it to, in both cases, like just letting go of that altogether is such a powerful,
Yeah,
such a powerful thing.
I also hear what you're saying. That's I think the pitfall with what I'm talking about is like getting lost in that place of wilderness where you're not willing to trust or love because of that fear of being let down in that same way. And I do think that's where like having that internal locus and being able to trust yourself is really important, because that allows me to enter communities. So I go to church. I'm a church
Yeah,
member.
yeah, yeah,
And some people are really triggered by, and I'm not saying everybody has to go to church, but for me, I go to church, and some people like really struggle, for instance, with suspicion towards any kind of organized religion. For me, it's like, I want to be a part of a community that is hungering for God still, hungering for the divine, for transcendence, that's wrestling with the big questions, that's asking, hey, how can we be a better, more loving community, a more inclusive community? How can we do justice and love mercy together and walk with God together? And I want to be a part of that. That doesn't mean that they're going to be perfect or they're going to let me down. I ultimately, I have to listen to the sound of the genuine within myself too. And that really is a higher allegiance in many ways. But that doesn't cut me off from community. I want to bring the best of myself to my community. And actually, if I wasn't listening to myself, then what am I really bringing to my community? I'm just like accepting some authoritative download that might not even be authentic to me. And so I do think you have to go inward as well, even as we belong to communities, but to not cut yourself off from that. I think we were made for that. Now, I do think there's a tension here. It's a struggle because it's true. Like the cultier the community, the more like I think thick that community will often be. And sometimes in the communities that don't really demand that cult like allegiance, they'll have thinner community. And so, for instance, what I've noticed in progressive churches, because they're not like if you don't tithe, you're going to hell. Like God needs your tithe. They don't say stuff like that. They don't pull those levers of guilt and shame. And as a result, their giving probably is not as high as some evangelical churches. Like the community, they're not saying you better be in church every Sunday. You know, if you want God's blessing, you got to be here every Sunday. They're not saying that. They're like, hey, if this is blessing your soul, then come. And as a result, they probably have a much more sporadic attendees than maybe more conservative or rigorous churches. And so you do lose some of that. And I don't have like the solve for that exactly, and I do think that we do have a bit of a hyper individualistic culture where as a result of some suspicion of institutions, the pendulum swing is that many of us are quite lonely and unmoored, but for good reason. Those institutions have often been abusive, controlling, manipulative, down the line.
Yeah.
And so it's a bit of a catch-22, I think, to be
And
honest.
we're cut like so. Just to offer, it's like a lot like a lot of the work that I do, and the studies with consciousness and religion, integrative health, and especially psychology. I think the symbolic and the imaginal is one of those things where I always look at this as a third way, where it's like people is like, okay, I don't want to be a literalist or fundamentalist. And I'm also not sure if I fit into the atheistic materialistic model, or those arguments just don't feel right either. I think that society writ large has lost its connection to the symbolic. We've lost our understanding of what symbolism means. We lost our we don't understand the imaginal. We don't understand the psyche. We don't understand because you'll
Believe.
say this, you're like, we need to connect to ourselves. And I see so many people when you're trained over years and years and years to not trust yourself, that process of to leave that and say, okay, like trust yourself. It's like, where do I start?
Yeah.
Like, and I see the symbolic and the imaginal of understanding that you can talk about Christ in a way that doesn't have to be the Christ of a flattened literalism. It can be, and saying it's symbolic doesn't mean it's saying it's not real. Like for me personally, I do not have any claims about the historical Jesus. I don't need to. I'm not worried about that. I'm worried about how Jesus is symbolically showing up in my life and what he's doing in me and changing me. And a big part of that for me is dream work. And I think dream work and some other psychotechnologies really offer that ability that I always, when I see people deconstructing, I'm always like, I just want to give them this information because I'm like, there's a whole world of things and
Yeah.
tools to reconnect
It,
with.
That's a great point. I think one of the big problems with evangelicalism, but broader than that, fundamentalist religion or fear-based religion, literalist religion, just the inability to see the power of metaphors. Like anytime, I mean, the resurrection is a great point. Like when we talk about the resurrection in evangelicalism, it was almost always about proof. Like the whole big idea with the resurrection is that and this is how we can know that Jesus is really God because he resurrected. This is proof that Jesus is God. And that just doesn't work because we weren't there. It's not proof. It'll never work as proof. You can't prove it in the way that you can prove something scientifically. It gives presence, and as a metaphor, it can be incredibly powerful. But as soon as you say the word metaphor in regards to something like the resurrection, people are just like, whoa, 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 whoa. Like you're doubting the resurrection and it loses all its spiritual power. And it's like, no, the spiritual power is in the symbol of it. You're not there. What do you mean? It's not in the proof of it. I really think that we've made everything so woodenly literal, even something like Jesus' sacrifice on the cross. Like I believe that the sacrifice of Jesus on the cross is a really powerful metaphor and a really gross, toxic, literal thing. Like when you make it literal, then all of a sudden, wait, it's a literal sacrifice? Wait, like Jesus had to pay like a blood debt to a bloodthirsty God. Like once you make it literal, it's like, that's actually disgusting. But as a metaphor, sacrificial love is a beautiful metaphor that we can embrace and incorporate into our lives. And that doesn't make it less real. I think that's what spirituality is all about. Metaphors that make our hearts sing, that transform us into love. And it seems crazy to me that you're right. We've lost the power of the symbolic. I couldn't agree with you more about that.
Yeah, and I always recommend to anybody. I love dream work. I'm in a part of a dream group. You mentioned community. I love this dream group is so precious to me, man. I love it so much because you get together and you share the most intimate parts of yourself and your psyche, really this unconscious voice that you get to meet in your dreams. And you share this, and you're all looking at these dreams in a really loving, supportive way. And my experience with the one that I'm in, it's almost like no one cares about what you believe. It's like, let's unpack and uncover where your psyche's at and what it's saying and what it's presenting to your ego and how you're wrestling with it. And like, let me support and encourage you with the deep intimacy of like who you are. And for me, it's been really healing because I remember going to small groups or going to certain things and having these thoughts of like, I don't know if I agree with this, but never feeling like I could say that, because it's like, once you say that, you're like, people start looking at you funny, going back to the beginning of the conversation. And so there's always that air of like, yeah, I have a rich community, but there is a caveat. And that caveat is I need to show up this way and I need to have a belief that's like this. Whereas like if you can find these communities that are very like, we don't care what you believe in, like we care what you're showing up with, and we are welcoming of that. To me, it's just such a shift. It's such a beautiful like, I've just been like, wow, it's really healing for me that, and I would love to see more communities like that start emerging in the world. And I look at what you're doing as kind of a part of that. I think it's building community around that sort of idea.
Yeah, I think it's tough to build institutions this way. You mentioned capitalism before, and I think that, I mean, just when you talk about monetizing it is where you start to run into trouble. And so somebody recently asked me on a podcast if I thought Christianity could exist without hell. And my answer was, well, I'm not sure that white evangelicalism as an institution could exist without hell, but I believe Christian spirituality could exist much better without hell. I think we would have a much better Christian spirituality without hell, but the institutions that we've built are very much based in binary thinking, fear-based mentality. Those are what drive, I mean, that's what drives budgets is, we're getting people converted. That's our mission statement. It's ultimately those fear-based tactics that are fueling revenue streams. And we have created an institution. And unfortunately, pastors go to seminaries that cost money and they have school debt potentially, and they expect to have jobs that are commensurate with their education. And as a result, we like have these institutions that we've built that I don't know if what we're talking about would be easy to have from within, like the sort of capitalist institutional evangelical religious structure that we've created. But I do think that we could have powerful real community and real spiritual connection with what we're talking about.
Yeah. And I mean, I've thought about this a lot. I actually have a lot of, oddly enough, have sympathy for a lot of the pastors that I know. Cause I feel like a lot of the pastors that fall into that end up having like, I feel like they do have a deep desire to want to do something that they're passionate about. And I feel like for many people, to what you're saying, when they feel that calling or that urge to want to do something, to participate with the transcendent and the divine, when they look out into the landscape and see their options, it's like, well, if I want to do this, here's the options that I have. And so I feel like many of them, and I'm sure there's bad eggs. I mean, like, I don't, of course, there is in everything, but I feel like a lot of those people are forced with the role of CEO. It's like, I've got to manage a company as opposed to being a pastor. And I think about like, because I was thinking about this with just studying, like, with the religious studies that I do, where I'm like able to dig into a lot of the history, a lot of the Platonism, a lot of like Greek thought, a lot of all of these different cultures. And I'm not saying that, pastors can read. I'm not saying like, oh, they're exempt from that. But I do think that like there is a reality in which like many of our pastors spend, they go from thing to thing trying to keep that capitalistic boat afloat, that they don't prioritize anything that isn't complementary to keeping that boat going. So it's like not always
Absolutely.
an evil thing. It's just like logistically, I think.
I can speak to that directly. When I was a pastor, I mean, I was a part of a non-affirming church, so it was not queer affirming. And so when I went to read books on that issue, I typically was reading the books that would solidify the position of the church that I was meant to support, because I was being paid. I mean, and I didn't think about it this cravenly, right? This is me like reflecting on it in retrospect, but I was being paid to not only believe that statement of faith, but also I was responsible for like teaching it and like helping other people understand it when they had questions. And so I wanted to be better at doing that. And so you're really financially incentivized to go deeper on the opinions that are already held by the church. I mean, to change my mind would have meant to be booted out of that community, which is ultimately, where things landed. But that's a really scary thing to do. And so even though pastors have more theological education than typical people, they are probably less able to be objective about any particular theological position. And most of their reading will be supporting the frameworks that they already have, not challenging those frameworks. They're not incentivized to challenge those frameworks. That's actually really frightening to do. They see those as threats. So books like mine, for instance, pastors will see it as a threat. Not like, oh, this is interesting, a new perspective we should engage with. Oh, he's engaging with the biblical text. This is somebody, who has done seminary and knows what they're talking about. No. They'll see it as a threat because ultimately, it threatens their institutions.
Yeah. Yeah, I was talking to a buddy he was a pastor, and we were talking about he was preparing for something, and I was talking to him about I don't know if it was Plotinus or Pseudo-Dionysius or one of these old guys, and from Greek thought. And he's like, yeah, I was like, I think I've heard that name, but I don't know. He's been through seminary. He's like, I don't know who that is. And I was just thinking to myself, I was like, it's just mind blowing to me how you can have a religion that was so interconnected to Hellenic thought and Hellenic traditions, and the thinkers of that time, and how you look at Origen and all these people that were in conversations with these people, and they have these thoughts, and yet you have a whole version of Christianity, or a whole version of like seminary or scholars that just have no idea that that world exists. Like, they don't know. It's like, you're sold. And so, like, for me, here's where I land with it, Brian. For anybody, it's like, this is not a debate to me, because here's the thing: like, we could go back and forth, and you're going to have reasons as to why somebody's going to have reasons as to why they believe what they believe. That's fine. But I just think that even the idea of multiple opinions and multiple thoughts and multiple interpretations, like, opens up the fact that, like, at the end of the day, we don't have to acknowledge who's right as to what, like, your theological beliefs are, but we just have to acknowledge the fact that there are multiple components to what's happening. Like, there's multiple streams of influence that has come into what we have today, that is not this singular linear causal chain
Yeah,
back to Christ that we
totally.
think it is.
Yeah,
And that thought,
absolutely. I I'll often say, like, yeah, there's Christianities, like to even put the S at the end, just because it's never been a monolith, and to act like it's a monolith is crazy, which is why I don't tell people they're not Christians. And actually, it's why, right now with Christian nationalism in our country, so much of Christianity is, fueled by the MAGA movement. And you have a lot of, Christians that are sort of baptizing what's happening with even deporting immigrants and things that Jesus was like absolutely, kind of really go against the actual words and message of Jesus, and they're using Christianity to reinforce it. And so a lot of times people will say, like, those people aren't Christians. Like, those people that are saying they're Christians, but that are supporting like Alligator Alcatraz, those aren't real Christians. And I'll even push back on that and say, like, I don't know, like, actually, I think Christianity has always contained multitudes. And you can find many examples in Christian history of exactly this kind of thing happening over and over and over again. And unfortunately, that's just a part of our tradition. It's not the only, like, you could also find resistance to things like that, right? It's always been like much more complex, and there's a lot of streams. And we've always been, we've had this curated idea of what we're allowed to think of as Christian. And for me, a lot of liberation has come with being exposed to the voices that I wasn't supposed to be listening to. Like, it's not just sort of Eurocentric theology shaping my thoughts about Christianity. I want to be reading Black liberation theology or womanist theology from different cultural perspectives that I was told, when you read theology, if it's from Calvin or Luther, that's just theology, right? That's just, there's no adjective in front of it. It's just theology. But if you read Kelly Brown Douglas, that's womanist theology because she's a Black woman doing it. So they put an adjective in front of it. So it's like a more, but the reality is we were told that there was a default theology, and there has just never been. It's just because that's just who's had power.
Yeah. Yeah, and there's so many other, even with I don't know if you read Vine Deloria Jr.'s work, but he's a, a theological PhD he's Native American too, and so his whole perspective is very interesting too, especially in regards to America. And we talk about, like, all the stuff we're talking about. I think you go back to colonization and Christianity, and what you just said. I think that's something that people's been saying for years. It's like, oh well, the people doing the Crusades, like, those weren't real those weren't real Christians. Or the people that, like, you could go throughout history and do that, but the problem is the thing that got built into what you believe was also built on that. So
Absolutely.
you can't extrapolate that. Like, so you could make the argument
Right.
that fundamentally, if we see a repeated pattern emerging from a thing, then you have to ask yourself the question, at what point are we saying, okay, wait a minute, this thing is not, and I think that comes from the literal,
Right.
the literal versus
Yeah.
symbolic would be for me, that's the shift, not the theological propositional beliefs are the shift, because that is, it's still intertwined to all of the, the baggage and the legacy that Christianity like has left.
Totally, dude. Yeah, I think that's a good point. When you see that pattern, it's like saying those aren't real Christians. That's not that helpful. Like if Christianity is producing this, and it produces many different things. It's also produced movements for social justice and the civil rights movement. That was born from Christian thought in many ways, not exclusively Christian thought, but certainly you could see that. It also, I mean, Germany was a Christian nation when Hitler took over, and he appealed to Christian language. Many Christian, the German Christian Church fully backed. And we can, not to draw those parallels too closely, but you can see parallels with what's happening right now with Christian nationalism. And so I don't try to defend the legacy of Christianity. I'm a Christian without having to say like, yeah, I don't need to whitewash the legacy, but it's always been bigger. There's always been many things happening within Christianity, but often we're only given like, oh, well, this is what it's supposed to look like.
Well, and I'm with you, man. And I always say it's like I have a deep relationship with Christ. Like whatever a person interprets that to be, or whatever their projection as to what that means is their thing. But I know, like from my experience and that understanding of what I do see, that's deeply there. And I think that that's for me the most important thing. Trying to defend an institution. It's like, yeah, I'm with you. Like it's become so many things that I don't know what it is. Trying to identify as a Christian to me is like, I just don't know what a person is hearing when I say that. So it's just easier not to. But
For
at the
sure.
same time, there is a relationship that I know of. And whatever a person wants to say, it's like, that's fine. Say it. But it doesn't change the past. And that's what I would encourage anybody
Right.
to like.
I'm less concerned with like how somebody identifies, and I would love, I want to know more about their values, how they got there, how they think about themselves, God, and other people. There's a lot more questions than just like, oh, well, I'm a Christian, so I'm safe. It's like, a lot of people been
Yeah.
Christian.
Well, and I would encourage anybody listening or anybody that follows, like, if you are going through that transition and feeling that need to like push out these things that you have felt that deep connection to, it's like you don't have to necessarily, right? Like you don't have to. And I think that's where the symbolic kind of can help bridge that gap.
Yeah, and for me, it's even been powerful to reclaim those things and to say, like, I'm not going to let those people with exclusionary theology or bigoted theology. I don't want them to have the last word on who Jesus is to me. I get to reclaim. They don't own Jesus. Jesus is too big and too good for those people to define who he is for everybody. So for me, it's been
Yeah.
a really empowering thing to hold on to that and say, yeah, like I'm leaving some of this behind, but not Jesus. And in even words like discipleship, I can take back because it's like, oh, you think that you own discipleship? Because discipleship means following Jesus. And I don't know what you're following, but like that white colonized Christ, that's not even the real guy? So I think there can be really empowering things about reclaiming that, but I would never say that somebody has to do that. For other people, it might be like, yeah, that was a deeply traumatizing thing I was a part of, and I have no desire to revisit that. And that's fine too. If those symbols are only going to trouble you, I never
Yeah.
push that on anyone.
Well, and that's the process. And I think that's where a lot of therapeutic processes for people can really help. And having someone that understands that framework to know those things and understands like kind of the nuance of it is really important. And then being able to, be patient with yourself and slow and like tuning into what is presenting itself in a way that feels authentic, but that's also, an incremental stage of growth that I can actually like sit with. Cause I do think inevitably the psyche is looking to orient itself, and we all need that orientation in a certain capacity just to function. Like the ego needs to have a set and a direction in which it's like, okay, here's a thing I can like stabilize myself on, and finding that stabilization first is really important, especially for people with intense trauma or people that have had like really bad experiences. Trying to force any prescriptive model is so dangerous and so challenging. And not giving it the time and realizing it's like this could take a month, it could take 5 years, it could take the rest of your life. Like who knows? It's like that's a part of the process. But Brian, we're running out of time here. But man, I really appreciate you coming on, man. I feel like I could talk to you all day.
Super fun, dude. Yeah, I enjoyed your insights as well.
Anything? I'll put a link to your book in the show notes below. But is there any other thing that you kind of that you do or that you produce or that you want to throw out there?
No, that's definitely the main thing that I'm pushing right now. I mean, I write on Substack, so you can subscribe to my Substack, which is called Beloved with Brian Recker, where I do, sometimes meditations on scripture, sometimes commentary on cultural events, whatever I feel like writing at any given time. You can be a free or a paid subscriber on there. But right now, I'm kind of in the full push on the book, which just came out about a month and a half ago. And what I would say is, yes, it's about hell, but it's about a lot more than that. It's about how, for many of us, we received a spirituality that was more about the afterlife than about this life, more about being on the right side of a punishing God rather than really getting to know God for who God really is, both inside of us and in the world and other people. Being able to really connect with and accept people where they're at without needing to change them or convert them. It's a totally different spiritual paradigm. And for me, shifting towards that has been, yeah, it was a battle that was long fought. And I think if I can help other people process that, yeah, I think this book could be helpful to you. For a lot of people, hell is like a load-bearing wall in their spirituality because so much of being a Christian had to do with believing the right things to not go there. And I think for a lot of us, it wasn't even fully clear how important that was. But when you take that out, then you realize, okay, no, spirituality is for here and now. It's about the kind of world that we build and who we're becoming. And it really just changes the conversation completely. And so the book is not just about, what does the Bible say about hell? It really does zoom out to a totally deconstructing a fear-based religion and inviting us to experience a spirituality of love for the sake of this world. And so if that sounds helpful to you, I'd love it if you checked out Hellbent, How the Fear of Hell Holds Christians Back from the Spirituality of Love.
Yeah. Oh, that's awesome, man. Well, like I said, man, I really appreciate you coming on and getting to have this conversation with you, and hopefully we'll get to do it again in the future sometime.
Absolutely, Trey. Good to meet you, bud.
Hey guys, before you go, if I could ask you one quick favor, if you enjoyed this video and you got something from it, I would sincerely appreciate it if you would like and maybe subscribe to the channel. Every bit of engagement helps. And in the meantime, if you're curious to check out more content like this, maybe check out this video or that video. Yeah, that's a good one. And don't forget to subscribe.